This episode is brought to you by Rad Dudes Who Love Nature.
Bald eagles. I mean, good heavens. The fact that bald eagles have become kind of a trash bird is just one of the most remarkable things I've seen.
Your words, not mine, but yes.
My 65 years. Well, there's no such thing as a trash bird in my estimation of any sort. If it's got feathers, it's not a trash bird.
Hi, podcast listeners. This is one of your co-hosts, Billy Brown. A few weeks ago, I got to talk to Scott Wiedensall, who is a bird researcher, conservationist, author, about some of his work for Grid Magazine, which I edit and write for. And it was such a great conversation, I decided to post the whole interview here on the podcast. Of course, as always, if you like it, please like us on your podcast listening app of choice. Please share it with all your friends on social media, traditional media, word of mouth, all of that good stuff. If you want to get in touch with us, drop us an email at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. What else? Please remember to get my book, Exploring Philly Nature, a guide for all 4 seasons from Temple University Press, if you haven't gotten it already. And if you want to keep reading urban writing that I put out, you can check out Where the Brown Snakes Roam on Substack. And of course, check out all of Scott Wiedensall's books. They're amazing, amazing deep dives into bird migration and other aspects of bird life. It'll leave you really inspired and really motivated to make some changes in the world to help birds, especially migrating birds. And you can hear all about that in an interview right now. And of course, if you want to support local environmental journalism in the Philadelphia area, check out gridphilly.com and make sure to subscribe to Grid Magazine. Thanks.
So I've got this split life. My day job is I'm a natural history writer. I write about conservation, but especially birds and bird migration and bird conservation. But then I also do a lot of field research about bird migration on the side. So, for example, I have a research project with the National Park Service studying bird migration in Denali National Park in Alaska. For the last more than 25 years, I've been running a big saw-whet owl banding project in central Pennsylvania, 3 sites in eastern and central Pennsylvania. I've been very involved for the last 7 or 8 years with something called the Modus Wildlife Tracking System, which is...
I'm sitting a few yards from Modus Tower right now.
Yeah, fantastic new technology that allows us to track even the tiniest migratory animals, not just the smallest birds, but migratory insects like monarch butterflies across hemispheric distances. And also something called Project Snowstorm, which is it's grown into one of the world's largest studies of snowy owl migration and winter ecology. So all that research stuff is kind of on the side. What pays the bills is the writing about all the research stuff.
Great. Yeah, I'm as a writer, I'm impressed that you pay the bills for for all that stuff.
I also have a wife who works for Massachusetts Audubon, and that goes a long way. She's
2-income household. There you go. That's important.
Absolutely.
I'm sort of, my mind boggles at the thought of how many airline miles you must accrue going into Alaska and everywhere else.
The best part and the worst part of my job is all the travel.
Yeah. So we're doing this for what we'll call a lay audience mostly. So I'm tempted to dive into the weeds, and I'm going to try not to. I read World on the Wing, and then I think Living on the Wind was the one from like 25 years ago now.
25 years, yeah, 1999.
Yeah, and so I remember that from a long time ago, and I think probably a lot of people have this reaction when they start reading these books is your mind gets absolutely blown by the distances involved with some of these migrations. But in that intervening time, so say from in the last 20 years, I'll ask you for 2 migration stories. Okay. One will be something in that 20-year span or so that you learned or that was learned by better tracking technology and methods that blew your mind already being an expert in this. and then I'll ask you for one one migration path that comes through Philadelphia that our readers might be pretty impressed by and that they could find more accessible right around here.
Certainly. Well, in fact, one of the reasons that I wrote A World on the Wing is because our understanding of migration science has changed so much and grown so dramatically in the last 25 years. Understanding the challenges the birds are facing, the physiological changes they undergo, and the hurdles that they overcome, flying these incredible distances. One of the migration phenomenon that I saw during the course of reporting on A World on the Wing is the longest migration of any raptor on Earth. It involves a bird called the Amur falcon, which is about the size of our American kestrel. It's a beautiful little, largely insectivorous falcon that nests in northeastern Asia, so northern China, Siberia, Mongolia, places like that. It winters in southern Africa, so that's 18,000 miles a year, which is about the same distance that Swainson's hawks from like the northern edge of their breeding range in the American prairies go to southern South America. The difference is the Amur falcons cross 2,400 miles of open water crossing the Indian Ocean. It's an astonishing thing to think about, and it's even more astonishing to see because before they make this journey, in late October, early November, they gather up by the millions in a part of northeastern India around the state of Nagaland, just south of China and Nepal, just north of Myanmar. And because these are insectivorous birds, they're gathering there at the end of the monsoon rains because that's when subterranean termites emerge from underground on their mating flights. So the air is filled every day with trillions of these big, fat, juicy, winged termites that these birds can pork up on and then make this incredible journey, migrating across the Indian Ocean. Now, one of the interesting things is that they may get takeout on the way, because scientists have recently found that there's also a large migration of dragonflies that goes from east to west across the Indian Ocean at the same time the Amur falcons are flying. So it's possible they may be snagging a snack out of the air on their way. And then they make it all the way down.
I'll say that dragonfly migration thing is something I only learned about in the past 10 years or so. I had taken on a naturalist, when I was working in Center City, Philadelphia, in the 8th floor of an office building. I took a picture of a large dragonfly that was resting on the outside of my office window. And then someone grabbed it for an iNaturalist group tracking migratory dragonflies. And that was my introduction to this. But
probably a green darner, which are the highly migratory species that we have here in eastern North America. And in fact, which come through in huge numbers down the Delmarva Peninsula, down through Cape May, across the Delaware Bay, down through the Delmarva. And you get down into places like eastern Mexico later in the fall, and you will see them by the millions. It's a sight that's almost as amazing to watch as the migration of the raptors going through that area in the fall. So, I mean, all sorts of cool migration going on. So then, and I think the second part of your question was something that we've learned recently.
Well, something that's closer to
something closer to home.
The Amur falcon stuff, that is amazing. But let's say, and you've got some of these like shorebirds that come down from Alaska, and but if we're saying something that that we might actually see here on this side of the country,
Well, I mean, the easiest thing to do would be go down to Cape May. In the springtime, when you have shorebirds, including red knots, that have spent the winter at the southern tip of South America, flying up to their breeding grounds in the high Canadian Arctic, so making about an 8,000, sometimes 9,000 mile one-way trip from the furthest extent of the Western Hemisphere in the south to almost the furthest extent of the Western Hemisphere in the north, and stopping off in the Delaware Bay for a couple of crucial weeks in May, where they need to more or less double their weight in a couple of weeks, feeding traditionally on the eggs of horseshoe crabs. Now, of course, the horseshoe crab population has been decimated in the Delaware Bay by 20 years of overfishing. There's still a tremendous amount of argument going on about preserving what's left of the horseshoe crabs. The red knots have suffered badly. Their population is a fraction of what it was back in the late 80s and early 90s when I started going down to the bay to watch them. But they're keeping faith with the North. They're still making this journey up across the hemisphere. And it's as easy as driving to a place like Reed's Beach. Now, I would encourage anyone who does this to please respect the birds. Stay off the beach. Don't flush them. They have just flown like 6,000 miles nonstop, and they need to feed before they fly a couple thousand more. And the last thing they need is you running your dog up and down the beach or playing frisbee over them. Give them a little space, but that's a relatively easy thing to watch as they're coming through here. Now, interestingly, because of that Modus wildlife tracking system that we mentioned before, we now know that Pennsylvania, which is a state where it's almost impossible to see a red knot in Pennsylvania. They just never seen on the ground in Pennsylvania. But almost all of those red knots that are staging up on the Delaware Bay cross over the airspace of Pennsylvania on their way flying north and west into the central Canadian Arctic. So just in the last couple of years, thanks to this new tracking technology, we've come to understand that the airspace of Pennsylvania is critical habitat for these birds. And so as we make decisions about things like ridgetop wind turbines, that's something that I think we need to at least take into account. I'm not saying we necessarily shouldn't be putting wind turbines up there, but we've tended to overlook the importance of airspace as a critical habitat for a lot of these migratory birds.
So we both, this is something I realized we didn't explain. We both know what Modus is, but I think it's a great example of the kind of technology that's revealed a lot about migration. Really quick. So I think it's since we can't talk about all the different technologies, probably. What is Modus, and how do these little life tag or whatever tags work on these birds?
Right, so it's MOTUS. It's from the Latin word meaning movement. The Modus Wildlife Tracking System was the brainchild of Birds Canada, which is kind of like the Canadian equivalent of the National Audubon Society. And it uses two pre-existing technologies, highly, highly miniaturized VHF radio transmitters. And I'm talking fraction of a gram. I mean, literally light enough in some cases you can put them on a butterfly. And automated receiver stations that basically look like somebody forgot to take down their old-fashioned television antenna. It's a big mast or pole. Sometimes they stand alone with guy wires. Sometimes they're mounted on top of buildings. At University of Pennsylvania in downtown Philadelphia, there's a Modus tower up on the roof of one of Penn's buildings, and all of the transmitters broadcast on the same frequency, but each one broadcasts a unique identification code. So as they're picked up by these receivers, the computer can tell whether it's a white-rumped sandpiper that was tagged on the shores of James Bay, or a gray-cheeked thrush that was tagged in the jungles of Colombia, or a scarlet tanager or wood thrush that was tagged in the forests of northern New Jersey. And then as they ping on all of these towers, and there's now like about 1,800 of these receiver stations scattered around the world, especially in eastern North America, but increasingly in the West, in the Caribbean, in Mexico, and Central and South America. It's revolutionizing our ability to track most migratory birds, because most migratory birds until recently were too small and light to put any kind of a long-distance transmitter on. So it's opening up a world of migration science and conservation information that we did not have until very recently.
When you say light, I think this is also interesting to drive home to people. When we look at something like one of the many warbler species that passes through on some of these big migrations, like how light are we talking about?
12 or 14 grams. And of course, there's 28 grams to an ounce. So something that's well less than half an ounce.
Yeah.
I used to joke that most of these birds, you could mail them anywhere in the country for two of them for a first class stamp.
Yeah.
Not that I encourage people to do that.
That would be illegal, folks. Yeah.
That would be illegal. But just to give you a sense of how little they weigh. And yet, blackpoll warblers that take off from the northeastern coast of North America in October will fly 3,300 miles nonstop across the western Atlantic Ocean and not make landfall until they reach the northeastern coast of South America. That's a journey of 4 or 5 days with no food, no water, no rest. This bird that's less than 6 inches long. Now, before it takes off, it'll increase its weight from 12 or 13 grams to like almost 20 grams. So it's got this enormous amount of fat on it. And it will burn up all that fat, and it will burn up a significant amount of its muscle mass and its organ tissue to make that flight, and then spend the winter down in the jungles of the Orinoco or Amazon basin, and then come back north, kind of up through the either across the Gulf of Mexico or up through the center of the country. So it's this huge loop migration. So even these tiny little birds do astonishing things.
Yeah, and as a species, I've seen, I think, in both directions, in parks in Philadelphia, and I've had this feeling of looking at them like on the edge of the Delaware when it's in the fall, and sort of thinking like, is this your last stop? Is this like, are you? Well, yeah, good luck, man.
Exactly. Well, but the thing is, they've been doing it for millions of years.
Yeah,
and they're really, really good at it. But also, it is such a challenging thing to do that the natural selection is ruthless. Any bird, the birds that survive are the best of the best of the best. And so every generation, any that are a little bit too weak or just not quite up to snuff get winnowed out. So that's why you can have birds like bar-tailed godwits that will take off from Alaska in the fall and fly 8,100 miles nonstop across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean to spend the winter in New Zealand or Australia. And that's a trip that will take them a minimum of 7 days, often up to 11 days of continuous, constant powered flight. They don't glide, they don't soar, they can't swim, so they can't stop off for a rest. And in fact, even on the islands of the South Pacific, there are just virtually no records of these birds. They make this enormous leap across the Pacific Ocean in one go. And the amazing thing is, after their first year, it's tough for the young birds. They have a harder time. But once they reach adulthood, their annual survival rate is like 96%. They do it every single year for 25 or 30 years, which is their average life.
It's a long time. And it's in the wrinkle that you had mentioned. I think that those juveniles their first year, they don't know they don't have a memory of where they're going, and they're not following anything.
No,
right? They're going on
mom
their
and
own.
dad.
Yeah,
That's right. Mom and dad left weeks earlier. They kind of abandoned the chicks when they're barely able to fly. So they're making this trip with others of their age entirely on instinct or drive or intuition or whatever it is. They just know they got to go that way, and they go. And I would love to know what is going through their mind when they're like on day 6 of this marathon. And they've seen nothing. They left the Hawaiian Islands behind a long time ago. They've seen nothing but ocean water.
Yeah.
It must be an extraordinary thing.
This gives me a sensation that I also felt when I was, I think, originally reading Living on the Wind, about the pelagics in sort of the sense that they aren't, maybe I wouldn't call it a migration exactly, but just that their life cycle takes them over these such huge expanses of the planet that it sort of makes the Earth feel small in a way.
Yes, absolutely. And it makes what we do feel kind of small too. I get so peeved when I hear people comparing migrant birds to human athletes, because excuse me, there's no comparison.
Yeah.
There's birds that are flying across the Western Atlantic, like blackpoll warblers or semi-palmated sandpipers. They're operating at like 9 or 10 times their base metabolism. A Tour de France cyclist is operating at 3 or 4 times his base metabolism.
And those people are like metabolic freaks, among humans. Yeah.
Yes. Now, I will say there's one funny aspect where some migratory birds have something in common with some Tour de France cyclists. These semi-palmated sandpipers, which are one of the most common migrant shorebirds on the East Coast, a lot of them in the fall stop on their way south on the Bay of Fundy, up between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and the coast of Maine. And when the tide goes out, the Bay of Fundy has these famously huge tides, 30, 40-foot tidal range. When the tide goes out, it exposes enormous mud flats. And in that mud are trillions and trillions of tiny little crustaceans called corophium. And the semi-palmated sandpipers seek out and preferentially feed on the corophium. Now, I've never eaten corophium. Maybe they taste really good with a little bit of cocktail sauce. But we know that corophium are very high in omega-3 fatty acids, which supercharge the aerobic capacity of the bird's flight muscles. So they're basically juicing on performance-enhancing drugs. Yeah. The difference between that and Lance Armstrong is what they're doing is legal in that.
True. I'll start with, well, we'll sort of midway, I guess, in the thinking. Not that many questions, but just still midway, we'll say. The question I'll ask again, with people living in a city who aren't, what we do is we try to write for a very urban audience that might not always think of themselves in the context of these global things. This is sort of a two-part question. Like why is it important to us? And why do people like this comes up with bird window collision stuff, where you're like, where the design aesthetics of a window matter more than sort of these birds sometimes. But so for people who really might look at these things and be like, oh, that's nice. Like, why is this important? And then, what can we do? Like I in my little commute in my West Philly neighborhood and my office in Chinatown, like sort of what are things that we as particularly people living in some of the least natural, in quotes, places, like why should we care? And then what can we do about it if we care?
I'm really glad you asked that, because I think cities have been an underappreciated linchpin in both the problems that migratory birds face and also some of the solutions for correcting those problems. We have become increasingly aware in the last, let's say 15, 20 years, both from eBird data, observational data that birders provide, and also from Doppler weather radar, which shows us in incredible detail where and when and in what numbers migratory birds are moving through the night sky. Because most birds, even the ones that are normally active in the daytime, migrate after dark. We've become aware of the way that cities draw migratory birds into them, literally like moths to the flame. The urban light pollution at night, especially in the fall when most of the birds migrating are naive young birds on their first migration, the cities pull these birds in. And of course, that's a problem because of window strikes, lighted skyscrapers at night and even, of course, even in the daytime. So cities like Philadelphia that have undertaken campaigns to get people to turn off their lights at night and control light pollution, that's terrifically important because we lose probably about 1 billion birds a year in North America to building strikes and window collisions. So it's huge. But also, even if we can control, like the real deadly buildings, get the skyscrapers to turn off their lights, there's so much light from the cities, from the suburbs, from the exurbs, that birds are going to get pulled into these areas anyway. And we're coming to understand the degree to which urban parks and green spaces are vital life rafts for tens to hundreds of millions of migratory birds every year. And so there's a solution, at least a way to mitigate some of the damage. And that's for us to start managing our parks and urban green spaces for birds as well as for people. I'm not saying we need to take our parks and give them over to birds completely, but because there's plenty of room for both. There's no reason why big expansive parks like Fairmount Park, which already has a lot of good natural habitat, can't have more. And this is where, urban birders, urban residents, people with, in the city with a concern for birds. And I'm not just talking about Philadelphia. I mean, this is universal, whether we're talking about Dallas or Chicago or Boston or wherever. If they get in touch with their city planners, their parks and recreation departments, the people who are responsible for managing those parks and green spaces, and tell them, we want to see more good natural habitat here. That means native plants, native species, particularly fruit-producing native shrubs like viburnums and dogwoods, which are beautiful, which don't require any maintenance. But it does require a mind shift, a bit of a perspective shift, because people tend to like things to be manicured, and nature likes a mess. Nature is not tidy. Yeah. But there's advantages. Nobody likes scraping Canada goose crap off their feet. And if you let the grass grow up and you let the thickets grow in, the geese don't like it and they avoid those places because they can't see what's sneaking up on them. There's some win-wins here that can actually improve improve things for some species of birds that really need the help, and maybe nudge the birds that are doing a little too well into some other areas where they're less of a problem.
So I got to throw you a softball here, Scott. What about exotic predators that we might have at our houses walking around some of these parks?
Well, funny you should ask that. Actually, if for the love of God, if you have a cat, please keep it in the house.
Thank you.
Because cats are, really pretty much without doubt, the single most damaging human-related cause of bird death. Somewhere between 2 and 4 billion with a B birds a year. So more than windmills, more than lighted skyscrapers, more than speeding cars. Of course, all of these things, cats and cars and windmills and everything else, all of that is cumulative. All of that is additive on top of the natural dangers these birds face. And so anything we can do to reduce that human-related mortality is a plus. And cats ought to be the easiest kind of low-hanging fruit. All you got to do is keep the door closed. And I don't care if you don't think your cat kills birds, your cat kills birds and voles and lizards and all sorts of other little things as well.
Yeah.
Now, it's also true that dogs are surprisingly disturbing to birds. Now, they don't eat birds the way cats do. They don't kill them.
No, but they scare the hell out of them.
They do. And it's funny because birds are pretty chill around people. They can learn very quickly in parks that the people are just going to ignore them. But there's a lot of research to show that even a leashed dog, even a well-behaved dog, is very disturbing to birds. It scares the birds away. So whether you've got your dog at the beach during migration time, or if you're walking your dog in a park, I'm not suggesting that we ban dogs from our city parks. But on the other hand, if a city is serious about creating an area that is good for birds, they might want to consider restricting dog walking in that part of the park. And I guarantee you there's a bunch of dog owners right now listening to me whose hair just caught fire because we all love
you say that, but I think of there's a large privately held park but publicly open, the Schuylkill Center for Environmental Education in Philadelphia, that does not permit dogs even on leash. So it's not that unheard of. Yeah.
No, the Massachusetts Audubon Society. My wife is a senior regional director. All of their wildlife sanctuaries are closed to dogs for that reason. And these are sanctuaries that are run by people who, for the most part, have dogs at home.
Right.
But they understand that dogs are very disturbing to wildlife. You know that they're a natural predator, and we know that the dog's on a leash, but the birds and the other animals.
Yep. So I'm going to ask this last question I thought of a few minutes ago before we started our call. And I was thinking of, I think it was a vignette you were writing about. It was, I think it was one of the ones in China, maybe near Shanghai or something, where and I don't know if we should name names, but like you were out there with someone who used to be a very senior government official, senior in we'll say senior in large corporations before that. And I don't know, I had sort of like a little bit of a double take, like this guy is a conservationist, and I think we just talked a second ago about pets and ways that like, I don't know how sometimes perhaps as pet owners, people's actions can be in conflict with their stated sort of environmental beliefs, let's say, or conservation beliefs. So I could see that as being possible up and down the chain of people's ability to influence the world and power and stuff. But I guess sort of how do you balance the need as someone who's a high level, who's operating in the circles that you do, as well as your wife, who's sort of a leader in an organization that relies on donations. How do you balance the need to be getting the attention and the buy-in of people when you're also advocating for things that if they were that could be in conflict with how they make their money, or and dogs and cats are talking about how people might even view their families, even like how do you have that? How do you work that balance there?
Well, it can be hard because anything that is emotionally close to home for a person can become an emotionally polarizing issue.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why the third rail of bird conservation has always been cats.
Yeah.
The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, you would have a very hard time finding anything on the RSPB's website about cats,
I
because
know, yeah.
England has more cat owners than any other country, and they know that they would lose half their membership if they came out against free running cats. So it's hard, and unfortunately, as I say, sometimes the choice has been made to just ignore the issue. But I have probably put my foot in my mouth more than once in making my feelings known to people who I thought should know better than what they were doing, and we've had conversations. Now, the person you're talking about is somebody who, despite the administration that they had worked with at a high level in the past, is somebody who has always walked the walk as a conservationist.
Okay.
Put their money where their mouth is. There were. We'll just leave it at that. Perhaps it'd be the best thing to do. But I will say that particular couple has also made a point of being the point of contact and proselytizing, shall we say, with others at similar levels of government and finance.
You figure people who get invited to Davos every year,
Exactly. Well, that's exactly what the level we're talking about. These are not the kind of people I usually run around with.
Yeah, not me. Yeah.
I want to make that very, very clear. We poor freelance writers don't get invited to Davos.
Yeah.
But I've been asked to hang around with, like, the former chair of the Fed and the head of the World Bank, and I've got the email for the CEO of TikTok, because these are people that these other folks have pulled in as potential converts to changing things for the better for the environment. So I think enlightened self-interest goes a long way as a motivation when you're talking to somebody, but also just the simple act of showing them a bird, really showing them a bird for the first time.
Yeah.
Many times these are people who've never taken the time or had the opportunity to see, like, a rookery full of nesting egrets and ibis and spoonbills, and on the southeastern coast on a spring day when the alligators are bellowing, and that can be a life-altering and perspective-altering experience. Look, it's my job is to let the birds be the best ambassadors that they can be, because the birds are already their best. They're the best argument for themselves.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. I've gotten to the end of my questions. Is there anything that you're sitting there saying, wait, you should have asked me about this?
Well, if we hadn't asked about the what can urban dwellers do, I was going to pounce on that one.
Yeah.
That was the most important thing. I would just say the other great thing, and you mentioned something about that cities are less natural. I think we're coming to understand that cities have a lot to offer birds, surprisingly, and we're seeing more and more species of birds moving into urban areas and adapting to them in ways that frankly surprised me. When I was growing up, in the 1960s and 1970s, ravens in the East were basically a wilderness bird. I mean, if you got really, really lucky, you might see a raven up in the mountains in northern Pennsylvania. They're nesting in the meadowlands now. We
just had a pair recorded nesting or starting nesting in Philadelphia. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's and peregrine falcons and red-tailed hawks and great horned owl. I mean, the list goes up. Bald eagles. I mean, good heavens. The fact that bald eagles have become kind of a trash bird is just one of the most remarkable things I've seen.
Your words, not mine, but yes.
My 65 years. Well, there's no such thing as a trash bird in my estimation of any sort. If it's got feathers, it's not a trash bird. But I mean, I think that we're recognizing that birds are inhabitants everywhere, and that cities, especially if we make fairly small accommodations, cities can be good places for birds.